Welcome everyone. Thank you for showing up so early. This is a great privilege to have this room almost filled. Thank you for Sang Gi-cho, professor. He's professor at University of Seoul. He helped us. He's hosting us at this amazing room this morning. So we're very lucky. This is the first of several or many conversations that we'll have for the Seoul Biennale International Studios, and we have a lot of amazing studios visiting us from abroad, but also, of course, local institutions that we're partnering with. And we are in a way the sort of the ground troops of the Seoul Biennale. We're in a privileged position because we're actually the first groups, the international studios are the first groups to actually come in and do intensive research on Seoul. So in a way, we are, of course, exploring the themes of the Biennale, but we can think of each other as in a way shaping and leading these themes too, at least for today, right? But in that regard, this is a kind of first early conference. So I know my own presentation is completely messy. You know, I'll blame that on my students, of course, because that's supposed to be a joke. But anyway, but it's a work in progress. So this is really about discussion. We're going to have a panel discussion after the 8 presentations. And after that, we'll invite also comments from the audience. So we will begin. Just really quick introductions. We have Jorge Almazan. If you can just raise your hand a little bit, from Keio University, visiting. And your students are here too, is that right? Let's see those students. Who's visiting from Keio? Hello, guys. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming. And his partner is Sang Gi-cho from University of Seoul. And are your students here today? Oh, yes. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Peter Ferretto, Chinese University of Hong Kong. Thanks so much. I heard you guys walked 16 kilometers yesterday, traversing the site. So this must be a treat for you guys to sit down. But I'm also hearing that usually Peter makes his students walk at least 20 kilometers, so you guys are behind. We have Hangman Jo from my university, from Seoul National, and we have some of your students here. Yes, thank you for skipping class. My students would not skip class. Thank you. I hope he writes you a good excuse. Rafael Luna from RISD, and he has brought his students. When did you arrive? Recently? Just Sunday, okay. We should have, you know what, mobility is one of the themes of the Biennale, and we should have your smartphone app. Let's have a competition at the end to see which studio walked the most. Myself, I'm the MC, I guess, today. Dongwoo Im from Washington University in St. Louis. And how many kilometers did your students walk? Oh, okay. They're trying to win this one. Okay. Mark Brosa from University of Seoul. And yes, thank you. Are your students here? Usually the most locals never show up. Yes. So that's right. And we have a great panel after this, so we'll have the presentations like I mentioned, but Suran Kim is walking here from Hongik University, Uni Lee from Ihwa is in the front row. We have, of course, our director, which we're so excited to have the director of the Seoul Biennale, Hyungmin Pai. He will join us, and also Thorsten Schutze from Sungkyunkwan University is here as well. And I'm going to try to rope in Kyung Park in the front row, but we'll see, into our panel. So the Biennale is, the name of the Biennale is Imminent Commons, and imminent was a word that we, Hyungmin will talk more about it, but it's a word that we threw around for a while to really capture the kind of impending, almost doomful aspect of the commons in crisis in a way, questioning the commons, reinventing the commons. So we named this Imminent Dongdaemun. Let me put it in full screen. So I just want to give a brief sort of summary of the international studios, what it is, why we're here, this kind of thing. So we are running in parallel. We are part of the Seoul Biennale, and we're running in parallel with this activity. So, like I mentioned, we're in a way the kind of today, at least, we're the first ground troops that are really doing insightful research into this. And of course, we'll have an exhibition space, and there will be many more overlaps to come, which are still emerging. And again, I think Hyungmin will introduce a little more, but just to see what's happening, the sites of the Biennale are in the old center of Seoul between Dongdaemun, which many of you have been to, on the right, and then Tonimun, the west gate, on the left. And there's a series of venues and exhibition spaces. But at the same time, just to locate where we are in the whole of Seoul, we're in this kind of area here. At the same time, there'll be kind of live projects and exhibition spaces. We will do speculative research, and these are some of the sites we're working on. Immediately around Dongdaemun, Changsindong, where there's a lot of production going on, the Ulchiro area. And instead of going to the West Gate, next semester there'll be some research happening near Seoul Station. And one of the big questions is the concept. Are we now at the end of the Anthropocene? If you guys, just to define Anthropocene, it's the global impact of human activity on this earth. And we've always framed our cities with humans at the kind of pyramidal apex. And sometimes we think that's good, human-centered cities. Why isn't that good? But actually, it's paradoxically maybe not the way to conceive of cities. Because if we put ourselves at the pyramidal apex, we are the consumers of energy. We are the consumers of the resources. And in that way, it's like, just as a bad example, we build highways to serve our cars, which serve our transportation needs, which we all know today is completely detrimental to the urban scene. So, I mean, that's just an obvious example of how human-centered thinking has actually put the crisis into the city, but also created massive inequalities. So another way to think of this, and this is just a little ideogram, is what if there's a horizontal relationship instead of a hierarchical one? And these are really the 10 themes of the Biennale. There's resources that we all should share, but then there's actions like making, sensing, recycling, connecting, moving, and sharing. I actually added 11th, archiving. My studio is working on this, but these are the actions that then preserve these 4 commons. And in a way that all of this can be a new way to define the urban commons. So the urban commons is no longer strictly spatial. It's not like the plaza in front of the government building or the church. The urban commons are a series of actions. It's a reconception of the commons. So we are looking beyond the idea of the functionalist city and the Anthropocene. The functionalist city is one of the aspects of the Anthropocene. And many of you have seen this kind of model by Le Corbusier, but you've also seen this in downtown Seoul, right? It looks very similar. So the Siam Charter, the Athens Charter in 1933 separated the functions of the city radically. Residential, low-scale residential, governmental, greenbelt, some kind of, I don't know what this is actually, but then there's storage and then there's factories. So the Athens Charter created this division of the city, and we see this replicated internationally. If you think of the way our cities are zoned, it's zoned through these activities. But the Athens Charter had a precedent. It was the Garden City. And of course, you guys have seen this diagram by Ebenezer Howard that begins to separate the functions of the city in terms of these bands. Very, very similar diagram to this. There's a reason for this, obviously, because the Industrial Revolution has gone in stages, and we are now in the 4th Industrial Revolution, and some of the participants will talk about this more. But of course, the 2nd and the 3rd Industrial Revolution were dirty, and it put industry in the center of the city, but for good reason. It was evacuated because the energy it takes to create and produce is dirty. We're in the 4th Industrial Revolution. I'm sorry these diagrams are a little ugly. I just copied them from the internet the other day. But the fourth industrial revolution has the promise of bringing ideas of smart production and smart energy. So bringing production back into the city is very important, especially for Dongdaemun. And you can see the rise of renewable energy really skyrocketing, and the kind of leveling off of dirty energy. So this is going to change the way we produce in the city. And it's going to look at technology as one example, but it's also going to look at the building fabric. You know, the vertical factory is becoming a huge kind of urban research project in many cities. This is an example where living and other programs are in this vertical factory. So there are core questions we're asking. This was in the Biennale brief, and I won't go through all of these, but a lot of them have to do with transportation. It has to do with governance and productivity. It has to do with the actual spaces and the networks of the urban commons, and it has to, and also looks at catalysts. What can we do now to transform the future? So our sites, they're going to be generally in this area, and each professor will explain more. But this area, as you know, is super interesting. It's full of dichotomies and interrelationships. On one hand, you have Changshindong, these small factories. On the other hand, you have this glitzy mall, which is on the edge of Dongdaemun Plaza. Both of these need each other. This woman actually made apparels for a retail store within 24 hours. Incredible kind of fast and intense relationship between consumer and production. And of course, there's amazing markets around the site. So many varieties of them and histories, including this almost abandoned Ulchiro market. Next semester, we have a studio looking primarily at the underground here. So this image of Changshindong is interesting. It really is the sort of the alter ego of Dongdaemun Plaza and the DDP, in that it's a part of the city that's outside of the city wall, just right outside of the East Gate, and it has a incredible fabric of hanok, small factories everywhere, topography, but this is just right outside the kind of the core of commerce. And one way I was describing our sites is the difference between monolithic and fixed and organic. I'm sorry, dynamic swarm. So a lot of people have seen this diagram from Stan Allen with birds moving almost in a parametric way, but kind of forming a situation. So he compares this to urbanism, but this is very similar to Dongdaemun. The reason why Namdaemun market has in a way declined is because one controlling entity has administered it, and so it actually doesn't have the nimble qualities that Dongdaemun has. Dongdaemun, most of the factories are 3, 4, 5 people, less than 10. And so these micro production, another theme that we're going to hear about today, actually allows these swarms to reconfigure. And it's only up to our imagination. Our studios can reimagine how these small productions, including printing, electronics, clothing, you name it, everything happens here. But it's almost like a swarm of activity. It's very resilient, and it's open to new forms of creativity. And this is what that swarm looks like. Of course, there's programmatic mix, like no tomorrow. It's very vibrant in that way. So I will sort of close with these 2 slides as a kind of question. Very interesting. These were from the History Museum in Seoul. One of them is from 1951, and one of them is just a few years before. It's hard to see the resolution, but this is a beautiful map showing every single lot, the kind of the fine grain of this area. Meanwhile, this was a new traffic planning, and they took the fine grain and they just massed it into these black and white finger grounds. There's no care, there's no concern for that fine grain. And so these logics collided, the new traffic patterns and then the fine grain, and they created, I would say they didn't negate each other. They actually created something maybe even more vibrant, maybe even with more potential. But we shall see from our brilliant professors what they've come up with. Thank you. And so Professor Hyungmin Pai will talk a little bit about the Biennale as a whole, and then we'll start with our presentations. This is a little, I can advance the slides
No, that's okay. I'll do. Hello, everybody. I'm Hyungmin, and welcome to Seoul. Welcome to the University of Seoul, and of course to our Biennale. And I stand here primarily as the co-director of the Seoul Biennale, together with Alejandro Zairopolo. He would have very much wanted to be with us, but he had to leave a few days ago, actually. And I'll just talk briefly. Now I've sort of repeated myself several times, my usual spiel about the Seoul Biennale and things, but I think you can rely on the brochure that we have out, and so I won't talk that much about the organization of the Biennale that much. John has eloquently talked about why we are dealing with the imminent commons, and the background of the Biennale, the existence of the Biennale can be explained by a recent shift of policy from the Seoul metropolitan government. The Biennale is fully sponsored by the city government, so it's a fully public, bureaucratic, amazingly difficultly bureaucratic Biennale. And I'll primarily just talk briefly about the architectural sort of initiatives. And because the new policy after the 07-08 global economic crisis, after decades of development-oriented policies, the government has shifted to more sustainable horizontal governance systems, smaller projects that are deemed as acupuncture that will change basically the organization of Seoul. So after 07-08, many cities of the world sort of retreated from active public intervention, but Seoul sort of continued to be very active. And so in terms of architectural projects, there are smaller projects that are spread out all over the city. You may have seen some of them, regeneration projects, Seon Plaza. And so this is a very new kind of urban and architectural initiative, and the Biennale is, of course, part of that. The ambitions are still very, very, very high and large. Though the projects are smaller, the idea is that departing from what John mentioned about the modernist sort of division of functions, the kind of modernist zoning, the new policies envision a kind of new, smaller units of community that come together in a very, very different kind of way. And so it departs from the kind of modernist zoning that was part of the planning ideas of Seoul for over 5 decades. And I will talk about how, the Biennale has organized itself as an international initiative that takes its sort of inspiration from some of the issues that Seoul faces. But I will you can read that in our brochure, and I'll just talk very briefly about why we have presented the commons as the primary theme. The commons is not a new phenomena. It is now a very, very prevalent issue, mostly in the economy, in the way that communities are organizing themselves. It is happening at this very moment, and so it is even not imminent. And we find when we walk around the streets of Seoul, and to any other major city, we discover that we are actually late, quite late, that many of the things that we thought were going to happen 5 years from now are already happening in the streets of Dongdaemun. And so, being a historian and a critic, I've been trying to think, as a director, you do basically administrative work. So I've taken this few minutes of this time to sort of think through what is the commons and why we as architecture students and urbanists need to think through this. And I think that the studios will be a wonderful opportunity to think about it. The commons, of course, is a Western, it's an English term. And it originates from pre-modern era economic and political organization. So even now in the UK, they make bad decisions in the House of Commons. The term originates from the medieval manor system. And so it predates the capitalist private system of land ownership. And so within the manor, the peasants would have certain rights to a common area that was given out by the lord, because it was to their interest that the commoners or the peasants would have a certain control over a common area, like a common grazing ground, which is the typical kind of common. And so people who have lived in Boston all know the Boston Common, which is, of course, a park right now. But the way it was set up was that British settlers came in and sort of enacting their old medieval system. They had this sort of green area that was commonly used for cow grazing. But of course, through modernization, the common became what is sometimes considered the first public park in the modern era. And so, you have remnants of sort of the old sort of grazing system. And so this sort of common, which was a kind of pre-modern, pre-capitalist mode of sharing between peasants, had to face a kind of modern situation. And so presently, now what was sort of originated as a pre-modern common is now public. It's civic ownership. And then around the Boston Common, you of course know that there are a series of privately owned land. And so as we see it now, it's sort of like the typical division, separation between the public sector and the private sector, and they have to work together well for capitalist society to function. And so why the commons issue is now so important is that this capitalist and modernist mode of division, we were talking about zoning and the separation of functions, but also I think together with that is the division between the private and the public. And the transformation, this sort of shifting is of course a very complex sort of engagement of different forces. It can be the new digital technologies that almost force you to act in different ways. We were talking, you saw images of Kakao, particularly prevalent in Korea. And so that these information systems are changing the way the public and private enact. And so whether some people think that this is sort of the beginning of the end of capitalism, and that what we understand as the division of public and private will be fundamentally changed by these new kinds of systems. But I this is something that is open. It's a question that is very important. It will be discussed. Some people think that we are entering a new form of monopoly. Kakao, Google is already ruling the world in a particular capitalist monopolist system, for example. And so this is a very, very important issue. And one of the discussions about the notion of a commons, particularly its transition from a pre-modern period to a capitalist system, was what is commonly called the issue of the tragedy of the commons. And this is a term that has been discussed throughout capitalist and even biological studies. So the term was made famous in 1968, though it had existed in the 19th century by ecologists. In fact, Garrett Hardin made wrote an essay, and it's been sort of the center of the issue of how we understand the issues of the commons. And so we have the common grazing ground, and so individual, whether they have private ownership of the cows, come and commonly graze. But individuals with their own reasonable private interest want to have more cows. And so more cows graze the land, and eventually this logic will destroy the commons. And it's a very simple idea, you know, it happens all the time. It's happening with the basic resources that we are dealing with. But and so the logic of the tragedy is that there is only two alternatives for the issue of the commons. Either you have a totally communistic society where there's no private ownership, and then there is then maybe a commons can exist. But of course, in that system, you wouldn't even call it a commons because everything would be commonly owned. And then in the private system, you would assume that everybody is just private ownership, and whatever is shared would only be run through the public governmental system. And so for a person like a biologist or ecologist like Hardin, he thinks that there's no way that this kind of pre-modern commons can exist. But so this has been a point of discussion, and I think particularly for architects and urbanists, John sort of mentioned the importance of space may be questioned with this issue, and you know, our studios will deal with specific issue of spaces in the city. But what many people have noted is that space is a commons. Of course, it's a very valuable commodity. It's a valuable entity within sort of dense urban situations. But the nature of space, urban space, is that the more you use it, actually, unlike the grazing ground, the more people use it, actually it becomes even more valuable. It enhances its quality. Its resource is not diminished. Of course, maybe if there are too many people using the streets, maybe it dissipates the value of the commons dissipates. But to a very, very wide sort of degree of flexibility, the more you use urban space, usually we think the better it becomes. And so the issue of density of use of space becomes a crucial issue in, I think, the issue of the commons, particularly as we are interested in. And the nature of this kind of use, intense use, has always been sort of with us. So the pre-modern issue of this sort of space, which was never clearly public or private. Officially, this is public space, and those who were with us in Venice 2 years ago are very familiar with this image. Kim Gi-chan, the photographer, captures a moment where a space that is publicly owned is now sort of privately used, and you wouldn't think that this is a bad thing. I mean, this is a kind of blurring of the boundary between public and private that is maybe a kind of continuation of pre-modern culture in Korea. And so though the term commons is a Western idea, it is prevalent in both East and West. So in the Korean tradition, you can talk about the common spaces within Hanok, within the villages, that were again not privately owned. It is a pre-modern system of ownership. Basically, during the Joseon dynasty, the king owns all the land, basically. But the king sort of divides the land, gives it to certain families. The families sort of deem certain areas to be commons. And so a kind of multifunctional, productive space was provided in different kinds of spaces. And though the Madang, the Hanok, has become extremely aestheticized in modern times, it was primarily defined as a productive space, much like the grazing ground and commons. And so there is a kind of tradition that I still think that exists in places like Dongdaemun, that is very, very cultural, that is intensely used. It has a kind of mixture of modern, pre-modern, and also post-human, as we were talking, the new kinds of technologies that are coming in. And so the point I think I would like to make is that we are dealing with a kind of synthetic phenomena with the commons, and the synthetic nature, I think, essentially has to do with space, and that's why we, as people in architecture and urbanism, have extremely important roles in this sort of emerging commons in the process. And so the commons is not a thing. I think John really made the essential point that it is an activity, it is a process, and that through this process, the larger shift and blurring between the public and the private, and the kind of divisions of the cities that we that are really breaking down at this very moment, is what we want to look at. And so this process is a very, very synthetic thing. Maybe everything is not really clearly connected, but it has a totality of relations that I think space can sort of capture. That the kind of traditional mode of the architectural interest is still quite relevant in the issue of the commons. So I think we welcome architecture students, all the faculty, to explore with all the energy and creativity and open-mindedness that is required to deal with the issue of the imminent commons. Thank you so much. Thank you.